So great to see so many people here. If everybody could squeeze in a little bit, there might be room for everyone on the seats. I can see those in the back. There's a few places. And yeah, we're all good friends. Thank you. Excellent. So it's a pleasure to welcome you to this conversation with Arthur Jafa. We have Jafa. We've been really looking forward to having you here since we opened the show with Frida Orupabo and your piece earlier this month. A lot of you know Arthur Jafa's work well, but I'm going to do a little introduction. So Arthur Jafa is an artist, filmmaker, and cinematographer based in Los Angeles who's been making work since the early 1990s. His the 1991 film Daughters of the Dust was directed by Julie Dash and earned him a Best Cinematography Award at the Sundance Film Festival. And later he worked with John Akomphrah on 7 Songs for Malcolm X in 1993 and Crooklyn by Spike Lee in 1994 and later on also with Stanley Kubrick. His first solo exhibition took place at Gavin Brown's Enterprise in 2016, although his work has appeared in various American institutions like the Whitney, ICA Philadelphia, Artist Space in New York, going back to the late 1990s. His solo show is a series of utterly improbable yet extraordinary renditions, opened in summer 2017 at the Serpentine in London. Travelled to Julia Stoschek collection in Berlin and is also, I believe, going to Moderna Museum in Stockholm later on this June. And his newest work is called The White Album and opened at the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive recently, which is also going to Venice Biennial's main exhibition, where also Frida Orupabo's work is going. So a very warm welcome to you, Arthur Jafa.
Thank you.
It's a long and laborious, but you know, it's a convention that has to be upheld.
Yeah.
And a very warm welcome to all of you here. I want to first of all encourage people to ask questions. You can interrupt us. You can ask questions along the way. We have some ambling microphones somewhere, so just so keep that in mind. Good. So, right. I wanted to.
Should we start off with just show something, maybe?
Yeah, sure. If you want to do that, let's do that. Show something.
The question is, what should we show? I like to show this thing. I didn't make this, but I like to show it just because it, in some ways, it sort of embodies everything that I aspire to. Well, most of the things that I aspire to, I would say. And I like to, it's just good, too. So maybe we can start off with a little of this. Okay, let's just let it keep playing. So I also like to sometimes just let it play with no sound, because I think most people would sort of acknowledge that the sound is magnificent. I mean, and it's, I mean, I wouldn't try to pretend like this is, typical. This is like a typical pitch, because this is just a really phenomenal performance. But the mode itself is something that's very familiar to anyone who even has a moderate interest in Black American music. And I often, like I say, show this just because I think, I like to present it to people and say, like, hey, this is pretty incredible. I think we all could kind of agree. But I also think it's incredible in terms just purely visually. I've oftentimes put forth a challenge to Black filmmakers to say, well, show me something that iconically is as powerful as that, like just that image itself, and it's a combination of course, obviously her presence. I mean, her physicality, her complexion, the sort of emotional intensity, her movements, which remind me a lot of my godmother's moves. My godmother was usher. Do you guys have like the ushers
Yeah, like
here in the
ticket,
churches? No, like in the churches.
Okay.
They have the usher thing, like in black churches, particularly in the South, particularly in Baptist churches and Methodist churches. They have these women who wear they wear all white. They look like nurses. Mm-hmm. If you didn't know anybody, you would think they were nurses. And they have white gloves, and they don't talk. Mm-hmm. They have all these hand signs and things that they generally use. And like, look at that. I mean, what can top that? I'm still trying to figure out how to make something that can do what that's doing. But my godmother was an usher in the church, and I always sometimes describe it as black kabuki, because they had all these hand signs and stuff that they did. And like I said, if you didn't know anybody, you would kind of think they were nurses and stuff, but they're definitely not nurses because they don't ever stop anybody from falling out. Like, you see people falling out all over the floor and stuff, and they don't stop them from falling out. They kind of just sort of stand over with their hands, like those women in The Price is Right or something, and say, sort of like, behold, And I was always very interested in that, in particular because I always felt like in the early 80s, one of the first interviews I ever read with Cornel West, which kind of blew my mind. I mean, I still think a lot about many of the things that he said in that interview. But one of the things that he said, because he was just talking in that sort of, encyclopedic, super broad way that he talks about things. And he was talking about black culture in general, the church in particular, the sermonic tradition, all these kinds of things. And at some point, the interviewer said, well, what do you think about black visual expression or black visual culture? And he said, well, as far as I can tell, it's not that apparent. And it was, it set off a little bit of a shitstorm in the context of the States, because particularly I think I remember Howard Pendell, who's a very sort of renowned artist now, but she was very angry with Cornell, and she said that he was basically speaking out of a lot of ignorance, like he didn't, that he was basically just giving ammunition to, the kinds of people or the forces that would like attempt to keep black people out of the visual arena, the visual arts arena. And I thought about what he said a lot, because in some ways I didn't completely disagree with him, and I'll explain what I meant by that. I felt like he used the wrong term. I don't think he should have said that black visual expression was underdeveloped, because anybody who's walked in any black neighborhood and just seen how black people dress and move and walk knows that that's visual expression. I mean, you see how black people penetrate space. You don't listen to people dance. You watch people dance, which is Soul Train or whatever, right? That's kind of undeniable, and that's visual expressivity. But I think what he really meant was pictorial expressivity. And I do think and when the person interrogated him, I think it was Andrew Stephenson, said, well, why do you think that is? Why do you think it's not that apparent? Underdeveloped, in fact. He said, well, he thought it was because that most black churches were essentially Protestant churches, and that Protestant churches had a kind of, tension between visual expression versus, like, say, a Catholic church. Like, if you go into a Catholic church, like, my grandmother was the Baptist church. My godmother was in a Methodist church. That's the first church I knew. But when I moved from Tupelo, Mississippi to Clarksdale, Mississippi at 7 years old, my parents put us in a private school, which was a Catholic school. So we then started attending Mass. And, if you're in a Catholic church, it's like a visual overload. The stained glass windows, all the sculptures, and quite arresting sculptures too, because many of the sculptures are, essentially people being tortured, nailed to pieces of wood and all this kind of stuff. So I remember the first time my cousin came to visit and he went to Mass with us, he was like totally freaked out. He said it's just like The Exorcist or something, like, you know, with all these bodies, flayed bodies, and all this kind of stuff. It freaked him the fuck out. But so, but what Cornell points out when he says like the pictorial tradition is underdeveloped, I actually thought he was onto something, because basically in a sense, I think I always like to cite Nam June Paik, the sort of godfather of video art. And he had this great quote where he said, the culture that's going to survive in the future is the culture that you carry around in your head, that you can carry around in your head. And I think if you look at the Middle Passage, meaning the migration, the forced migration of black people from Africa to the Americas, you see such a profound demonstration of that, because black Americans, black people in the West in particular, you know, in the Americas, whether it be, you know, Jamaica, the U.S., or all, you know, different places and stuff, we are super strong in oratorical expressivity, dance, musical expressivity. These are all things that you can carry on your nervous system. And not only can you carry them on your nervous system, but when we found ourselves in this sort of existential circumstances, you know, the sort of chaotic and traumatic circumstances that we found ourselves in the Americas, we could continue to practice those things, you know, whether you are on a plantation, enslaved, whether you're on a chain gang, you know, I mean, you can continue to sing, and so many of our songs were woven around the sort of enforced labor and stuff that we, you know, that was a big part of our lives. So I think Cornell was really onto something around this question. So the question to me had always been, as a person who was visual or had an impulse to be visual, is like, why is it that on one hand I can say, if you said, well, give me an example of black musical expressivity, I could, you know what I mean? We could spend the whole night just listing names, one name after the other. And if you say black music, it's not one thing. People talk about diversity, but nobody would ever confuse Jimi Hendrix with Billie Holiday, with Marvin Gaye, with Sam Cooke, with, you know, Aretha Franklin. I mean, you can just, the list is endless. And all those things are unique and specific. Yet, at the same time, pretty much everybody could identify each of those things as black music. So I've always been like super obsessed with this idea, like, how come it's so broad and expansive and deep and so affecting? Because it's not just black people who are moved by black music. Everybody is more or less moved by black music. I mean, it's a sort of generalization, but I think it's true. So why is it's so broad and expansive, and yet at the same time, most people could very quickly say that's black music. In many instances, they can identify it as black music, and the producers of it are not even black. You know what I mean? Like, I've been discussing, we talked about it a little bit earlier today, like with Basic Channel and stuff like that, who were, you know, essentially making the best dub music in the world, and they're Germans.
German.
You know, so even that to me is like super fascinating. So the question to me always was, okay, if in this arena there's so much expressive virtuosity, genius, I think undeniable, how come when we go to the visual space, not the same equivalent, or even in the realm of the same equivalent of expressive possibility? Particularly given the fact that we know that coming from Africa, that the visual arts, visual expressivity, material expressivity in Africa is just as diverse and broad and extensive as musical expressivity. We know that there's no modern art without African art. It just doesn't exist. You can't really do a history of how we landed where we are without factoring in the impact of African sculpture in particular, the impact that it had on Western art practice. It's just, there's no way to tell that story without actually dealing with how African art redirected in some ways, deflected the trajectory of Western art practice. So for me, again, as an artist, my question has always been, and it's become, I've said it so many times at this point, it's become almost like a mantra, like how can we make cinema or any sort of visual art form with the power of beauty and alienation of black music.
Yeah. And this is a quote that I recognize from when you've been talking about love is the message and the message is death, which hopefully everybody here has now seen. It's upstairs in the installation. You, in connection with that work, you have talked about black visual intonation. Is that what you're? Is that what you mean by what you just said, or do you want to go a little bit deeper and explain what you mean by black visual intonation?
What's been kind of interesting is because my career, such as it is still fairly recent. It's like I'm going on a little over 3 years. A little over 3 years now in terms of a career. Now, this doesn't mean that obviously these are things that I've been thinking about for 30 some years, but my trajectory was I studied architecture at Howard University, became discouraged with the possibility that I was going to be able to not so much make a living, but able to do the kinds of things that I was interested in. It seemed to me
through architecture.
Through architecture, yeah, because it seemed to me very, very early on that there was a class dimension to architecture, and it was just I love Mies van der Rohe, but I didn't have a bunch of rich uncles who were gonna, subsidize architectural follies, so I could get started. Most people I knew didn't own their homes. They certainly weren't in a position to, commission me to make experimental black architecture.
Missing a trick.
And so for me, I was like, I couldn't see a path to get to where I want to get, because the things that I was interested in then were the same things that I'm interested in now. I wouldn't have I've thought about these things and how to talk about these things for 30 years now, but so I wouldn't necessarily have articulated them then as I would now. But at the time I would have said something like, if Kind of Blue was a house, what would it look like? And really it was about this whole idea of difference, just recognizing that the way Black Americans in particular approach things was just different. Not necessarily better necessarily, but different and in fact specific. And so I was very interested in that specificity. So growing up in the South in Mississippi, I grew up around a lot of houses that people in fact had built, even though they were quote unquote weren't architects. Sure. But like shotgun shacks and things like that, I was pretty obsessed with. But at the same time, like I said, I couldn't really figure out how to get from the things that I was envisioning from where I was. So I sort of slowly but surely drifted towards film, which was something I had always been interested in, but didn't know people made film. Frankly, before I got to college, I wasn't really. I thought of films the way I think of cars, Somebody obviously designs a car, but, it's just like they were manufactured. I wasn't really thinking about you could go to college and study film. So while I was at Howard, and particularly being in D.C. at the time, which had a really incredible, because this is before VCRs and all this kind of stuff. Anybody under a certain age can't envision this, but prior to VCRs and all this kind of stuff, it was actually really difficult to see films. It was certainly not possible to have repeat screenings of films, So when I got to D.C. in the late 70s, like 79, 80, they had a very extensive repertoire film chain, meaning like a theaters that would just show old films. Mm-hmm. And they would print a schedule 3 months at a time, and you could look on that schedule, and you knew on such and such a date it was going to be a double feature, Sergei Parajanov's Shadows of Our Forgotten Ancestors and Tarkovsky's Andrei Rublev or whatever, you know what I mean? And then the next night it would be like Taxi Driver and whatever else. So that first year in D.C., I just saw a ton of movies. And it definitely, over the course of the 3 years that I was in the architecture program, or the 4 years, but, I increasingly was like interested in film, and I was actually sort of thinking, okay, I'm going to transfer to New York University, because at the time, I think there were really sort of only 3 film schools that anybody ever heard of. There was like NYU, USC, and UCLA. And my mom said, well, why don't you take some classes or something while you're at Howard? And I just sort of very casually, almost accidentally just drifted down to the film department. And I think the first person I met was Haile Greenman. If you know anything about Black independent filmmaking, Haile is at the very center of like these ideas around specifically Black modalities of filmmaking. So almost from day one, it was like, we have to make Black cinema. And that was a revolutionary, for me, it was a sort of transformative idea that, wow, there's this, a Black film, okay, a Black film, what does that mean, And to a certain degree, my time at Howard was spent both receiving the idea and in many ways challenging the ideas that they put forth around what a black film was. And so just to get back to the original question, so I then sort of began to pursue film, had some very early success, like particularly with Daughters of the Dust, and then working with Spike Lee on Crooklyn. Well, John Akomphrah first, before Crooklyn, and then working with Spike on Crooklyn. And really, literally just became like super disenchanted with film because I just felt like I could...
Disenchanted.
Disenchanted.
Yeah.
Super disenchanted. A really good friend of mine is here. I could almost bring him up and have him just talk for the rest of the night about our experiences working with Mr. Lee, who's a brilliant...
Disenchanting?
Yeah, who's a brilliant person. He's I could also spend the whole night talking about how transformative Spike is as a presence, but it wasn't fun. It wasn't fun. It wasn't a lot of fun, let's say. And
how wasn't it fun?
Without going into it too deep or anything, because like I do super respect Spike. I can't even, it's hard to overstate how much he transformed the landscape. But as I said to somebody, my exit, if they have what do they call it, exit interview would have been something like, yeah, I feel like a jazz man in a bar mitzvah band or something, or a polka band or whatever, it just was not, it wasn't a really good fit, like for me expressively. And so in a sense, I was a little spoiled because the first thing I shot was Daughters, so I thought that was the real world, and it really wasn't the real world, So I said, okay, this, shooting shit for people is for the birds. I'm just going to do my own thing. And then I just proceeded over the next 5 or 6 years.
Then you worked with Kubrick?
It's just so funny because last night when I was having a dinner with my friends, I was like, this Kubrick thing is a virus, man. You can't fucking stamp it out.
Sorry, we're
Kubrick and Jay-Z and Solange. Those are the three. I don't have nothing to do with them. There's not a critique of them. Yeah, I did, but it was really just B-roll stuff. It wasn't really...
No, I only brought Kubrick out because you also were very inspired by 2001.
Totally, super profound impact.
That's something you've talked about before, how you saw that at a very early age.
Yeah, 2001. But I know I'm sort of super roundabout, but I'm going to actually try to answer your question.
Black visual intonation, that's where
exactly.
we were. Yes.
So this period following my disenchantment with being a cinematographer was a period where I was developing my own projects. And one of the things that I was actually pursuing super aggressively was this idea of Black visual intonation, which is actually, like, it's funny how in the last several years it's become some sort of meta thing in relationship to my practice, which has been interesting. I hadn't necessarily anticipated that, nor necessarily even agree with it, but I've had some pretty convincing people have made arguments to me about how it's a good way to frame an overall thing. But in fact, Black visual intonation is a very specific technical thing. It's basically a way to manipulate motion in films in a way that parallels Black vocal intonation. Mm-hmm. So it's like it's a technical thing.
It's a technical... Yeah,
because like when my early mentors and stuff were saying black film, I was at a certain point I was like, okay, cool, well, what makes it black film? And to a certain degree their response was what I would term a polemical response. It was all about your political affiliation and your intent and stuff like that, all the things which I think matter, but I don't think just because you're black or you're politically down it makes it black cinema.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've earlier said something around that the camera is essentially white, even if it is used by a black man or woman. Is this
not so much as white? It's because what I said was that,
or the camera gaze.
Exactly. Yeah. On the psychoanalytical level, I said that when you point cameras at people, particularly black people, that it actually functions as a white gaze, even if in fact there's a black person behind the camera. And can you explain that a little bit more? It's pretty straightforward. I mean, it just means that like so much of black meaning the sort of behavior or the sociality of black people, is framed by the context of having been enslaved and actually having been, in a, let's say, under the power or the gaze or the force of white supremacy. So a lot of what we do, particularly in public, is done with a complete and thorough and formidable understanding of the nature of white supremacy and how it functions. And the mechanism, one of the primary mechanisms by which white supremacy functions, of course, is the white gaze, meaning you're being looked at, you're being surveilled. So if you point a camera at somebody, you're not necessarily going to get what they really think. What you're going to get is what they think white people want black people to think. See what I'm saying? So, like, if you turn the camera off of black people, you're going to get a completely different kind of behavior. So, like, on a psychoanalytical level, it just means that you have to contend with that. Because in a sense, it doesn't matter ultimately if a black person is recording what you say or a white person or Asian person. It doesn't really matter, because what happens is at the end of the day, there's evidence of what you said. In other words, that evidence can end up in someone's hands who can use that against you. So black people tend to have, they call it code breaking and code shifting and stuff. Like, I can talk in a certain kind of way, and if it's all black people in the audience, I can talk about the same kinds of things, but completely shift. And oftentimes when I'm in mixed audiences, which more often than not they are, there are certain things that I can say, and I know in general, black people are hearing one thing and white people are hearing something else completely. Yeah. So, but to me, that's not to say that that's some big preoccupation of mine. It's just an aside, really, because you can't necessarily not use a camera if you want to do cinema. You know what I mean? You sort of have to accept and just kind of push through that. I did a project, one of my documentaries. We decided not to film anybody. I mean, we filmed people, but we didn't film people when we were interviewing them. So the whole project was done where we would just do audio interviews with people, and then we would shoot them separately, like somewhere else. And it was an experiment that was driven by this particular notion, a hypothesis. And it was very interesting to see how forthcoming people were, much more forthcoming than if you would point a camera at somebody. So, yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
I was wondering if we could see, talking about black visual intonation, maybe a little bit of Apex, which
Sure.
I asked you to bring.
I mean, the thing about Apex
do you want to say something about it?
Well, not so much what it's about or anything like that. Because I've been told time and time again by my friends I'm terrible talking about what my films are about. I don't know what they're about. But I can talk about the process, the process, how I arrived at making them. But, I don't even try to pretend I know what they're about. But I can say this about Apex and Love is the Message, is they both are demos for a lot of my ideas around black visual intonation. So, there are things about them that are technically super specific to how they're put together that I think is a big part of why, particularly with Love is the Message, that people have had the kind of...
epiphanic.
Yeah, people have a big emotional responses to it. Yeah. So that's been interesting.
Is it possible to sort of articulate that specific technical methods that you?
Yeah, it's super straightforward. It's like basically black visual intonation sort of revolves around the idea, without getting into a long, super technical explanation of it, revolves around the idea that the spaces in between the exposures or exposure intervals is that when you use a movie camera, typically you use what I call metronomic exposure intervals, meaning like the pictures that are taken, the space in between each picture, the interval is even or metronomic. Okay? It doesn't matter if you shoot slow motion, fast, but it doesn't matter because you can shoot 100 frames per second, but if you lay those frames out, you'll see that the space in between each frame is the same. And there's a kind of equivalence between that and in Western music or classical music, a diatonic scale, like even tones and stuff. But basically when you get away from regular exposure intervals, right, balanced gaps, it creates certain neurological effects. It's the same thing like if you go to Indian music and and like you get down to microtones and stuff, quarter, 16th notes, all these kinds of things. Things that in the context of the West, it's not like they don't exist in Western music, but they certainly are problematic tonalities that were considered bad tones. At a certain point, you could actually be burned at the stake for actually, utilizing certain tones and stuff. It's why even sometimes when people say the blues is the devil's music and flat and fifths and all this kind of stuff, so much of black music, meaning black American music, but African music too, it's a generalization, but it's true. They use just intonation, which means like the tones are essentially, as a musicologist put it, in the 16th century, he found himself in Africa. He was a missionary. He was a trained musicologist, and he was writing notes about the music that he was hearing in the sort of area that he had been posted. And he said the problem with studying the music of the Negroes is their tendency to worry the note.
Yeah, worry the note.
And what he meant by worry the note is that unlike in the West where tones are, stable sonic phenomena, in Africa, in Bali, and a lot of places, but particularly in Africa, tones are inherently semi-stable sonic phenomena. So you can see it's just so much like Charlie Parker takes a solo. He takes improvisation, he does a solo. They notate the solo, write the notation down, all the notes he played, and they play it back, and it's not Charlie Parker's solo. Why is that? That happened time and time again. It was because the Western notational system couldn't account for everything that was actually going on in the actual solo itself. It could only describe the notes in time and in space, but it couldn't describe, say, for example, the battery of English he was putting on the notes. In other words, they would write a thing down. It's kind of like you see in a digital quantization era. They would write it down as an A sharp, but in fact, if you actually put it on the scope, it's not an A sharp. It's actually fluctuating between one thing and the next. And that flux is the equivalent to some of the things that you can see when you start fucking with the intervals between the actual pictures. You see this in silent films when people hand crank cameras, it's the same thing. Like in Chaplin, a lot of why Chaplin is visceral the way it is because by necessity with a hand crank camera, you get irregular exposure intervals. So all I did was take that insight of irregular exposure intervals and repurpose it by synchronizing the irregularities with things like Aretha Franklin's tone.
Right. In Norwegian, I guess, music, you have the Harding fiddle, which does the overtones and the undertones and was also associated with the devil. So there's, I guess, within folk musics all around the world, there might be this there's this relationship. But anyway, I'm dying for us to play Apex.
It's going to be a little anticlimactic after that. But, yeah. Oh, yeah, thank you. Forgot.
It's running well.
Oh, no!
It's back. Yeah, so Apex. John Akomphrah has a line about this. We're outside the window catching lost futures hurled towards the abyss of oblivion, is what he said about this. It's a phenomenal piece. I think in this Robert Hood, right? The Detroit techno producer, and how maybe now that you explain the intonation technically, how the images aren't really following the rhythm, or there is a sort of...
Well, the thing is with that one in particular, it's a little... it's a little of an inside joke because except for those two little short clips where there's motion, every image in here is exactly the same. Okay. Same length.
But somehow it doesn't quite.
It's because the music. Because the music is moving around, and it's really sort of a demonstration of how, like when he goes with that counter rhythm, because he's got but when he goes with that it makes it seem like the music, the rhythm, the images are speeding up. It's fascinating to me. Yeah. But it's not like everyone is exactly the same length except for those two little moments of motion. So
when is this piece from?
Is
it
6 or 7 years ago. I can't remember.
Yeah.
I worked on it for a long time. It was like a lot of the stuff I do was just out of frustration, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was. I mean, when it got declared art, I was like, okay. I mean, it was something I was showing to my friends because I was developing this big science fiction film called Apex, which I didn't think was possible. I mean, I couldn't see how I was going to get it made because it's, you know, $100+ million film to make. Sort of described it as a sort of black 21st century Lord of the Rings or something, you know. And I was sort of working on the script, and then I just started compiling like I do oftentimes, just throwing images that went along with the script in a file. And then I discovered Bridge, which really changed my whole thing. Bridge here. Discovered Bridge, and all of a sudden these things that, you know, I had in a file were on the grid. So, like, for example, like, not every day, but, you know, but generally multiple times a week, I always, like, for every month, like, see right here, we're in March. And it's like March, the first week of March, day 1, day 2, day 3. And I basically just throw anything in the file I'm interested in. It's not, it's whatever catches my eye. And I do this pretty much. I mean, as I'm
collection of images that.
Yeah, I'm very resistant. People start, you know, all this archive stuff. I'm sort of, you know, it's not archive fever or anything like that. I don't even know, like, you know, I like Derrida too, but I don't know. Like YouTube, I don't know if YouTube is an archive in the way we typically understand an archive. It's just a repository of things. So what happened was I was just throwing stuff in the files, you know? And then I opened Bridge and I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. So say, for example, like I'm working on this other project now and I just threw things in the file and I like 6 myself. You can scale it, see? So I went to 6 and then I just started with Apex. I just started then tweaking the order of them. And then once I got the order more or less in place, I started color correcting all the images. And so a lot of Apex is a kind of manifesto on how I think black skin tone should be treated in films, all these kinds of things. And then it just really was a way to start thinking about just sequence in the pure sense. Because there's no real, except for those 2 moments, there's no motion in it, but there's cadence in it. There's no simulated motion, but there's cadence. And so it was a way just to think about how one image follows another image with in some kind of specificity, you know, whether it be the images are rhyming or the color is matching, or, I mean, at their best, images, you're doing more than one thing at the same time. You know, they rhyme or the color matches and there's some thematic going on. So, yeah.
And, well, you mentioned science fiction, and there's also in the film upstairs, there's also quite a lot of clips of Alien. And so I don't know if you want to say anything about the role of science fiction in your work, or is there some kind of...
The role of science fiction. I don't know if I would state it as a role of science fiction. I'm a geek. I grew up, you know, reading comic books and reading science fiction. Yeah. And I think in some ways there's certain pressure that's exhibited as a black person when you read science fiction or particularly when you look at science fiction movies. Because science fiction movies are like the idiot offspring of science fiction literature, you know. And just, you know, black people just aren't in them too often. And that was something that, you know, exerts a certain pressure on it when you're watching them as a young person in particular. And as, you know, as I've spoken of in the past with a film like 2001, Space Odyssey, which really had a really profound impact on me. I mean, I could probably make the case if I tried to that Apex is, you know, it's just the Jupiter Falls sequence extended into, you know, other kinds of possibilities. Wow. But but basically one is like very cognizant of the absence of black people, because it's not just a casual absence of black people. It's like the absolute and extreme absence of black people in that film. I mean, the people don't just, it's like not just a lack of black people, like the people act really white. Like they just very white acting. There's like ain't no black people around even, because everybody's like, they sit a certain way, they talk a certain way. But it seems to me like, and I've sort of obviously made this argument before, but it seems to me like it's impossible that a Bronx, a guy who grew up in the Bronx who was Jewish could make a film that didn't have anything to do with black people on any level in 1967. It's just like impossible. And I sort of made the case that you see a kind of inverse obsession with blackness that's like coursing through 2001. I mean, you could almost describe it as a film where the white people move from one pocket of whiteness or start to another pocket of whiteness. But mostly what they're preoccupied with is blackness. They're like surrounded by blackness the whole time, and it kind of drives them a little crazy, and then in the end, they get to Jupiter. They're basically being directed by this black entity, the monolith, right? Like, why is it black? I mean, one presumes, since it's supposed to be the dawn of man, that you're in Africa already. But let's assume for a second that the filmmakers didn't realize that those apes were African. Okay, and so that's the beginning of man. And the guy has the ape has the white bone, but he only has the white bone after he touches the black monolith. And then he basically follows the black monolith. White man follows the black monolith to the moon, where they discover another black monolith, which shoots a signal to Jupiter, and they follow that signal. When they get there, they are confronted with yet another black monolith. And then I read originally it was even supposed to be a pyramid, which would have been like very Sun Ra.
I was just going to say, you said Sun Ra. I mean, Medicine for a Nightmare is Frida's title of the show, and it's a reference to Sun Ra. And at the same time, in the 70s, there were groups, Mothership Connection,
right.
P-Funk, and Sun Ra, who, I'm not sure if everyone are aware, but there is this that people now term Afrofuturism.
Yeah, I hate that term, but I hate it, but exactly.
But it's somehow an umbrella term for and Sun Ra used to say he was from Saturn. He was from a different planet. He was an alien on Earth.
Right. I mean, the whole Black American story is nothing but a story of alien abduction. It's the classic science fiction story. It's like these aliens come, they take you to a whole nother place. A world that's totally different from the world you knew, and then they force you to interbreed with them. It's like, the whole black story is a zombie apocalypse already. And I mean, we can laugh about it, but it's kind of true. Yeah. It's kind of true. So one's relationship to science fiction is a very particular relationship to science fiction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess Robert Hood that we heard, I mean, the whole, there's a whole myth of a group called Drexciya, which comes from the same time and the same area, who has a whole sort of myth around their music, where they are envisaging that blacks jumped off the ship and started a subaquatic species.
Civilization.
And the music is similar to Robert Hood's. It's it's very hardcore techno.
Yeah.
There's quite a lot of. It's a rich.
I mean, black people were the first technology in the Americas. We were technology. I mean, and it's why despite the Civil War and all this, in spite of the Civil War and all this kind of stuff, like slavery was on its last legs, precisely because, the mechanization of production, cotton production and stuff made actually having people as slaves to do labor obsolete. So it was becoming obsolete already, But obviously, it didn't stop racism. Racism continued, even though in fact
and it's
slavery
thriving more than ever. It feels.
Yes.
if anybody has any questions,
don't be
raise-
shy. I heard
don't be
y'all
shy.
was shy. Somebody
There's
told
one
me.
sort of last.
Said Norwegians were shy.
Well, I guess there's two. Oh, here we go.
I was just wondering about the use of
There go Mike.
I was wondering about the usage of images of Africans and in Apex and the way that you oscillate between, for formal reasons, visual reasons, but also if you could just say more about the way that in your own visual language, Africa is in dialogue with African American images and experiences.
That almost goes into the zone of what is my work about.
Sorry, too broad.
No. It's like, I make a lot of my decisions because they seem dope. It's dope. Moving from this to that just has a certain energy. It's got a certain charge. Like I could rationalize and I could tell you the story of Apex, say for example. Like if I told you the story, you would see that pretty much everything in there is connected to the narrative, so to speak. Like I said, my dealer Gavin saw it on my laptop and said, "Oh, we should show that at Art Basel." And we showed it at Art Basel, and everybody said it's art. And I just, cool, And then people started asking me about it. And I said, well, the best I could come up with, I said it's like Todd Lynn's, Monument to the International. It's a model of something that never got made. So that's how I understood it. But the oscillation, Africans are dope. Black people are dope. White people are dope too. That's why there's a lot of white people in there. I mean, it's what it does, I think the part of the effect of it is it's not functioning inside of certain kinds of interdictions that we're used to. It doesn't. The choices that I'm making them because they're dope, but basically they're choices that don't subscribe to the kind of apartheid, the kind of separation that you typically see between Africans and African Americans, between white people and black people. You know what I mean? I think it's a very apocalyptic vision, but strangely, it's also a very utopian vision because it's not, the race thing functions in a very different kind of way inside of it, I think. It's not like I was trying to make a kumbaya moment or anything, but it's just, that's just the world. It's like, I like to think that it just has some of the complexity of the world. Most of the things we see are complex because they are very specific types of evasions of the complexity of the world. They're distortions, you know what I mean? Like you see a Woody Allen film, ain't no black people in it, it's all in New York. Like, what kind of, that shit is not real. It's impossible to walk around New York, even on the Upper East Side or wherever the fuck he was supposed to be, and not run into black people. It's just it's not in the real world. You know what I'm saying? So, a lot of the sort of charge of it is because of its refusals, like what it's refusing to do. So I would say, just from my perspective, what you're saying, I think is on point in a way. But from my perspective as a person who organized the images and stuff, it has less to do with what I'm trying to do than what I'm refusing to do. That aspect of it, it's a refusal to accept the typical sort of separation between blacks and whites and Africans and everybody else. So these Norwegians are asking questions, I was told before. It's like they're too polite. They're not going to ask any questions. I'm assuming he's Norwegian.
I'm not Norwegian.
No.
You're not, okay.
You got two non-Norwegians. That's.
I was born in Soviet Union, so it's literally on opposite side, on discourse and everything. So I'll come back to that. In your previous interviews, you mentioned that all music is black. And black music is the shit.
Except for Mozart.
So obviously.
Well, Mozart was black, but go ahead, keep going though. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
But I was wondering, could you talk more about the difference between?
Beethoven. I'm sorry. Beethoven, not Mozart. Don't want to take credit for everything. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
The difference between the African music and black music. there is. I know that there is you've been talking before. There is a massive difference there.
Yeah.
So I would like you to talk a bit more about. And the second one, which relates to the Soviet Union thing, because then the wall went down and techno came. It was enormous effect on the whole culture.
Mm-hmm.
The 808, the kick drum, is kind of that's the sound of modernity.
Yes.
So the for me it's like the most important invention in the beginning of 21st or the end of 20th.
Mm-hmm.
So is the techno since you've been around already working in as an artist before the techno arrived in the scene, do you see that shift as well on yours? The
shift from what to what?
Like the effect of techno, then techno arrived. I don't know.
Black folks are interesting folks. We're very interesting. We oftentimes make shit that we're not interested in, and everybody else is interested in it. Or they're more interested in it than us, you know. They're like genius techno artists walking around Detroit and all these places who know in their neighborhoods nobody knows who they are. And if they come to Europe, they're like gods, you know. I mean, black music clearly was the dominant cultural form of the 20th century. It's kind of indisputable. It's like the only other thing that you could kind of maybe make an argument for is cinema, which obviously was an incredible cultural force in the 20th century as well. I mean, it's one of the reasons, just as a quick aside, why I think the whole proposition of black cinema is such a powerful, frightening proposition, because you really are talking about bringing together the two dominant modalities of cultural expressivity in the 20th century, which would be black music and all of its offshoots, and cinema, you know, bringing those two things together. But the techno thing is like, I'm fascinated by it because it's, as is often the case with black musical expressivity, it's viral. You know what I mean? It's not like techno was not pop music. It's like subway graffiti would be the equivalent in some ways. Like, I often say to people, the last new visual art form of the 20th century was wild style graffiti from New York. It spread over the world the same way techno did, virally. It just popped up all of a sudden. You start seeing it in all these European cities, all over the walls everywhere. And this is like completely absent of any kind of economic superstructure to make it happen. In other words, nobody was making money off of it. Nobody was selling them. They're not like paintings or artists getting paid for it. It just struck a chord with people. Very, very similar. I think you could probably, even though in fact the music of the people who created graffiti was not techno music, but in a very weird kind of way, when I first started going to Europe in the late 70s, I think the first time I went to Paris, I started hearing techno and seeing graffiti on the walls at the same time. Okay. So there's something really fascinating about why is it that the musical is undeniable, but even this other thing, this expressivity, what is it about it that seems to be quintessentially late 20th century and certainly 21st century? What is it about techno that, as you said, it's the sound of the 21st century? Why is that? Now, I have some ideas about why black music in the 20th century was such a powerful catalytic force, because it's not just that it's African music, because African music didn't do what black music did. I think there's a distinction between African music and black music. The way I've described it, and this is just a hypothesis, right? My hypothesis is you take one, if not the oldest musical continuity or tradition on the face of the earth, meaning it has complexity. It has musical sophistication and complexity. I love Jerzy Grotowski. He talks about ancient vibratory songs, like songs that have developed between one human being passing it to another human being. It's like not authored, not like a Beethoven. It's just these forms have been passed back and forth for centuries, right? So you have this musical tradition that's super, super rich, centered in West Africa. And in as far as Black Americans are concerned, centered mostly in West Africa. But like is often the case with very developed artistic traditions and stuff, they have a tight relationship to power. Like the equivalent would be if you go to the Louvre or something. Like if you go to the Louvre and you look at the paintings, like what are they paintings of? Mostly church figures. At one point, it's all the church. It's religious figures, right? And then at a certain point, it's the middle class or the mercantile class. In other words, paintings were being subsidized. The paintings were of who was subsidizing the painters. At a certain point, it's a pope or it's a cardinal, whether it's Bernini or whatever. And so they do sculptures and pictures of those people. So there's a tight relationship between power and artistic expression. So in the context of Africa, there's a similar kind of relationship between those musical forms. They are royal forms. Despite the fantasy that everybody in Africa was a utopian music, but that's still very different. Clapping along to the music is super different from the specialists who actually produced the music. And they were subsidized by the royalty, right? So I think what happens in the context of Black music, and again, this is my hypothesis, what happens is like, it's kind of like when you have like the sort of myth around AIDS, right? You know, the HIV virus. One of the stories they say is that it leapt the species barrier. It was in one species, these green monkeys, and when it leapt the species barrier into human beings had no internal mechanisms to counteract it. There was no predation to stop it. So when wildfire, okay? So what I think happened is Black people who are enslaved bring these complex musical forms with them to the U.S. And it's almost paradoxical because on one hand, even though we find ourselves in circumstances where our actual mobility is radically circumscribed, you know, we're not allowed to be self-determined, the music paradoxically is unleashed because it's freed from the power relationship where we're singing, like if you say like, you like griots and stuff like this, well, griots are singing about kings. They're not really singing about common people too deep, right? So the whole musical edifice gets shifted to this other context where it's unleashed from that tight relationship to power. So Black people now have this incredible musical form, but they find themselves in existential circumstances, or to say the very least dramatic. They may be outside maybe one or two other things, the single most dramatic existential circumstances of the 20th century. So it's something about the now taking this thing that's super sophisticated and it being wielded to the circumstances in which we found ourselves, I think that goes some way to explaining the difference between the power of Black music versus the power of African music, and why that music, because the experience that Black people had in the 20th century is the quintessential experience of globalization and being the subjects of global capitalism, all these kinds of things. We're the canary in the mine shaft. So where we have gone, everybody else is going there. Look at all this migrant crisis and all this kind of stuff. People are having a 21st century equivalent of what happened to Black people over the last several hundred years. That music is inscribed with a lot of that stuff. I think that's the basis on a sort of, not formal, some of it's formal power, but there's some sort of psychic power that I think is grounded somewhere in that space. It's why Basic Channel, like I was fascinated with why Basic Channel, these guys are making this incredible music. Like I was like, why first of all, they attracted to this particular form, and why are they doing it so well? Because being attracted to it is very different from doing it well. They're doing it powerfully, I think, because I was like, for example, if you want to talk about how existential circumstances impact themselves on formal dimensions of art, like a dub structure. It's one of the most basic fundamental structures of Black music is a dub structure. It just means things are here and then things are gone. Meaning, if you take in reggae, you got a bass, super present bass, rhythm guitar, voices. But in dub music, what happens is everything is playing, doom, 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 jank, jank, the drum, and then at a certain point, everything drops out except boom, doom, 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 doom. And what is the effect of that? It makes you hyper aware of all the things that are gone. And then all the things come back in. I would argue that psychoanalytically, that's a replay of the experience that black people had of being missing over and over. That's one of the primal experiences of black people in the West. You love somebody, that person is taken. They're not killed, they are taken away. They are made missing. If somebody kills my daughter in front of me, I know what to do with my anger. It's very focused. If my daughter is taken away, and I never know what happened to her on a psychoanalytical level, that's much more complicated to resolve. I think those kinds of things played themselves out in the music. So dub, why would Germans be attracted to dub? Because one of their quintessential experiences is absencing. Their subject position inside of the psychoanalytical structure is different because they are, structurally speaking, not the ones who are made absent, but the ones who made absent. I think that's why that music triggered something and why they made powerful examples of it. And it's a great example of how these forms travel. But I think it's something which I haven't had the time nor inclination to go beyond these initial kind of ideas about. There's something about techno that's operating in this space around what's happening to everyday, around migrant crisis, people being moved, disrupting society. There's something etched or inscribed in techno that's tapping that. And that's why, that would be my guess.
So, we have 2 more clips that we wanted to show, or you wanted to show. Your
There are more than 2. Okay, what should we show?
you have loads, but we talked about 2 of your new projects.
White Album. I just say it like that because one of the things about having a career such as it is, things do become somewhat transactional, which is very weird to me. Like, I like to just show whatever I'm feeling like showing. But now it's like, okay, I made this thing, the White Album. It's like being on a talk show or something. Like, what is your new thing that's coming out, Sometimes I like to just show things. Like, I feel like oftentimes people see my work and they say, it's so depressing or it's so apocalyptic. Sometimes I just want to show pretty things, nice things, like things that feel like, I'm going to show something, okay? Because everybody has this vision of me, man. It's like, I guess I'm responsible for it, but.
The full film is what, 30 minutes?
It's showing in Berkeley now, and it's 29 minutes, but the version, I'm sorry. The version that is that's going to show in Venice is about just a little short of an hour long. So, yeah.
The White Album.
Yeah. Somebody told me, a friend of mine, he was like, everybody's so excited. You're making something about white people now.
Tell us about us.
Well, I don't actually even, it's funny. They just sent me a review. Like, the gallery just sent me something that somebody wrote recently. And they said at the end, it was like, very paradoxically, it's not so much about white people as about race, which I think is true. Like, if you see the whole thing, the whole trajectory of the piece. But
what we just saw was, I guess, found footage, video. Music video?
Some of it's found. The portraits of the people's faces obviously are not found. Those are shot, but it's like it goes back and forth between these portraits of friends of mine, actually. As I've said, it was so funny. Like, asking my friends, "Hey, would you let me shoot you for this thing? What is it? It's called the White Album. I'm just shooting white people." I know, and they're like, "I don't know." Some people turn me down. On a certain level, it's about trust, because people had to trust me that I'm not, nobody. It's funny, nobody wants to be in proximity to bad whiteness. I don't even want to be in the same film with it, but I felt like, to me, it's very much about the tension between like on one hand, and I've sort of said this, but it's the tension on one hand between whiteness as I understand it. You know, Cornel West has another great thing he said. He said there's certain things you cannot not know as a black person in America. And he doesn't really name those things, but I think at the top of that list would be whiteness. I mean, you have to have a very formidable and complex working understanding of whiteness in order to survive this environment psychically. You have, certainly in America. Just like women have to have, they could be feminists or not feminists. They still have to have a profound understanding of patriarchy in order to survive. Just like gay people have to have a profound understanding of heteronormativity in order to survive. You have to. You're not allowed to not have it and flourish. You can't flourish. So on one hand, it's like what I cannot not know about whiteness, and yet I have all these people in my life who I adore and love who are white. So like, what do you do with that? It's a complicated navigation in your head to do, because I can't discard. Like on one hand, it's like Elijah Muhammad. White people are devils. You need that. I'm trying to get my son to understand that. He's like, Dad, you're a fucking racist. But I'm trying to get him to understand, like, in a white supremacist environment, you have to almost assume that white people are devils. It's the only efficient way to go about it. And then people have to prove themselves to not be devils. Because if you go out here assuming everybody's all right in a white supremacist environment, let me tell you, you will be crushed. You will be crushed, right? So the assumption is, just like women know not to go down a dark alley, you can be a feminist or an anti-feminist, and you still know that, right? So what you have to know, and yet I have these people who, some of whom I just adore and some I absolutely love. And so it's about, what do you do with that? I mean, how do you reconcile it? I mean, you can't reconcile it. It's just the two things coexist. And so in some ways the piece is a little bit, not a declaration about it, but it's a little bit an attempt to model it or something.
Where does Iggy Pop fit in, and the
besides him being the greatest rock star of the latter half, second half of the 20th century? What does he represent? Besides being dope. He represents a white person who has a very atypical relationship to black being. I'm trying to actually shoot him. I'm trying to get permission to do the portrait of him, so he'll be one of the portraits that comes up in the end, which it will, I mean, it'll be horrible if I can't get him, but if I do get him, the structural implications with seeing the CGI version, seeing the real person, it's really about, you know, how we're seeing constructions, like they're all constructions. But I'm also trying to shoot Jacob Holtz. I don't know if you guys know Jacob Holtz. You know the book American Pictures? Another white guy with a very atypical relationship to black being. That book American Pictures is, I think, the most profound photographic document of American poverty or of America, of the American South that I grew up in, that's ever been produced. And it was only possible because I remember when I first saw the book, I was like, how did this guy get these fucking pictures? Like, he has pictures, like, I was like, how is he getting permission to take these pictures? Like, people having sex, interracial couples, trans couples, gay couples. He got pictures of KKK having sex. It's crazy. Like, and I just be like, how's he getting these pictures? And the first time I saw an interview with him, he was like, I had one principle. I never said no to anything. Now, that's a very interesting, that's hardcore. That's real hardcore. I had to say, I was like, you're a better artist than I am. That's very hardcore. And the thing about it, just recently I'm going to do a show at the Louisiana Museum, and I met Matthias, one of the curators there, and they came to LA, they were shooting something for their channel, Louisiana Channel, and they came and he sent it as a gift, American Pictures, not knowing, have you ever heard of this book? And I was like, yes, I'm obsessed with this book. And then he was like, the story is that Jacob Holtz was raped multiple times in the course of him taking his pictures. Now, of course he was raped. I mean, but what does it mean to be raped when you say your principle is not to say no to anything, right? But my thing is, like, what he had done is embraced a kind of precarity, as they say, the precarity of black life. He had embraced something that is a structural given for black people, particularly black women. And so he is a white man with a very atypical relationship to black being, as is Iggy Pop and one or two other people. I'm hoping I'll have opportunity to shoot.
And the footage, the sort of footage of somebody going into a room or going into a building.
That's Dylan Roof. You guys know Dylan Roof?
Dylan Roof?
Dylan Roof is the guy who went into church and killed all the black people. So that was surveillance camera footage. So you see him going in before, and then when he comes out, that's after he's killed all those people. Mm. Yeah. That's what I cannot not know.
Well, we're gonna have to round this up. It's fascinating, and it can go on and on. I do want to it would be great to just say to touch a little bit on your new project, which is Robert Johnson biopic. Am I right?
It is right. I don't know if I'm supposed to be talking about it in public, but yeah, I'm endeavoring to make a narrative feature film about Robert Johnson.
A Hollywood produced feature film.
I don't know.
Yeah.
So Hollywood. Maybe Hollywood. I don't know.
Yeah.
I try to avoid that part of it, not thinking about that part of it. But a narrative feature film. Yeah.
And you're working with Carrie James Marshall for this?
I don't want to talk about that part.
Okay.
I have some very brilliant collaborators who are going to work with me on it.
Yeah.
It's it's funny, when I pitched it, I told them, Robert Johnson, he was the first rock star in Mississippi, was Transylvania. So that's how I framed it. And
wow.
I don't know how much people know about Robert Johnson, but so-called king of the Delta blues, and he really is like the first. He's the prototype of the rock star. He was the beginning of the 27-year-old club in the 20th century. He's the first that I know of a person who died on the precipice of, probably certainly greater fame than he had experienced up to that point. And it was, so that's like Hendrix and Cobain and everybody else.
And it's interesting also in terms of race, because it was Alan Lomax, a white man, who recorded Robert Johnson.
Well, no, he
not
didn't.
Robert Johnson,
but many of the blues guys,
in the South, and there's a huge record collection or record collecting sort of obsessives who will track down these original 78s.
That's right.
And they're largely white male, I would assume.
But that's like very similar to the question about techno. How come like black people?
Yeah, absolutely.
Black people are not museum. We're not museum oriented. We're like oriented towards keeping it moving. It's hey, thank God for obsessive British white guys, else half the music would be gone. And thank God for, obsessive Germans and Russians, or half the techno would be gone.
Yeah.
So, hey, the world is paradoxical.
Yeah.
You just have to
go.
The
White Album by the Beatles wouldn't exist if it weren't for Robert Johnson, right?
I think a large percentage of what we call rock now wouldn't exist without Robert Johnson. Certainly not our structural understanding of how rock works.
Yeah. It's interesting how the blues has also become a kind of, a sort of almost like a shorthand in advertising, a shorthand for authenticity in advertising. You see the close up of a frothy beer bottle with somebody on a porch, and there's a blues kind of book, and it's also a music that has become very sort of hollowed out in a way by capitalists.
Well, I mean,
forces.
it's being used in a certain kind of way, but I don't know. I think,
Or the Levi's commercials or whatever.
yeah, I worked on some of those. Actually, I did. I worked on the, I think, John, did you work on that? The Wild Turkey thing? Yeah. I did a commercial with a really good friend of mine, Malik Saeed, for Wild Turkey Bourbon. And it was, the tagline was Wild Turkey, the real deal. And they wanted, as they said, authentic Delta bluesman. So I got hired to shoot it, but also I got hired to go down and scout locations and stuff, you know. So it's like, in a strange kind of way, I think the blues, you know, it's like emblematic of authenticity. But that authenticity is completely bound up to precarity and all this other stuff. You know, that's shit. Jacob Holst's shit is real. Like, people start talking about keeping it real. Yo, allowing yourself to be raped, that's keeping it very, very, very real. To take some pictures, shoot, man, I'm sorry. I hate to, I'm not trying to laugh at it, but I'm just saying, you know. Should I show the thing?
Sure. Yeah, if you can.
Yeah, this is a study for the Robert Johnson thing. It's just something that I basically have started. It goes along with the script, and it's mostly like, this is what I sent to people who I was trying to get to collaborate with me. This is the first thing that I showed them. Just to get, it's not, you know, it's not going to have, the movie is not going to have still images. It's going to be a proper movie, like at a movie theater. But this is what I put together.
Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, we're done. Okay.
I don't know. I think it's, we've probably, if anybody sort of burns it in with a question, I just don't, I think it's such a beautiful way to end. But we're going over like with an hour. Okay.
Thank you. I agree. It would be a wonderful way to end. But I'm actually burning. If you could just go a little bit back to your cooperation with John Akomphrah, since his wonderful two-screen work Auto da Fe is also being on show just right down the street in the Museum of Cultural History right now. So and your work is so wonderful in different ways. So and you were talking about pace and motion, and it seems like his work Auto da Fe from 2015, it's kind of a little bit slower than real time. And your work being on show here is a little bit, or quite a much big, very much faster pace. So just a few comments about your cooperation, and if it's real serendipity that you both are on show in Oslo at the same time, or did you plan on this? Thank you.
Well, as far as I know, the second part is serendipity. I love John. I mean, I went, when I shot 7 Songs for Malcolm X, I had met John a couple years before that, and just, I mean, I could almost write it's certainly going to be a chapter if I ever do a memoir or anything. He just has had a profound impact on my thinking, and if you've ever met him, he's just the warmest, most brilliant person like you would ever meet in the world. It's like I kind of basically was on the verge of moving to London to join Black Audio Film Collective after I worked with them, but they sort of came apart in the seams, you know, right as I was like poised to try to move to London. When I met them, I felt like I had met my tribe, because like in a lot of ways, like I identified with the people who I would say mentored me, like which would be like Hyla Grima and Larry Clark and Ben Caldwell, folks like that. But they were like, you know, all 15, 20 years older than me. And my contemporaries, kind of corny, basically. Kind of corny, basically. I mean, the stuff that they were sort of aspiring to do. I mean, I never want to get into trouble, so I don't mention any names, but, you know, just like a bunch of cornball shit. And it just didn't, it just wasn't, you know, it wasn't even ambitious. I mean, it wasn't even like it was ambitious. So when I met John, they were like, I mean, they liked a lot. John in particular liked a lot of the things that I like. We both are obsessed with Andrei Tarkovsky. He's my favorite filmmaker. You know, I mean, one of my quick tests of anything is like, what would Tarkovsky do? You know, particularly if it's things that you can't imagine Tarkovsky really doing. Like I always like wanted to see like Tarkovsky's version of Little Richard's life, you know, shit like that, you know. So I would always ask myself, what would Tarkovsky do? But me and John, we bonded around Tarkovsky and our love of jazz and thinking about jazz in a certain kind of way. I mean, jazz really is the model at the end of the day, even though, you know, I can talk about techno, and I'm interested in techno and electronic music and funk and all these other things. But at the end of the day, jazz just seems to be, you know, the modality where permutational strategies and improvisation and structural complexity and all these kinds of things seems to be wound into the very fabric of it, you know, versus, you know, not to diminish like the other forms and stuff, but oftentimes, you know, I just feel like jazz at its best is like the unified field theory of black music, you know. And then there's something very fascinating too about, you know, what on a certain level would seem to be a kind of oxymoronic term, black abstraction. You know, if it's abstract, how's it black? You know what I mean? And so jazz epitomizes that, as does techno, which I think is black abstraction. I mean, it's very interesting. You can't talk about techno and the way techno has moved through the world without talking about how parallel hip-hop has moved through the world. I mean, there's this weird back and forth dance between hip-hop and techno. But the language, the presence of language in the center of hip-hop, I think, blocks, you know, it's like, in some ways I would say, one of the criteria for a form being great is the degree to which other people take it and make their own things with it. Like, to me, Black American hip-hop is still the best hip-hop on the face of the earth. I don't think anybody would kind of dispute that. But I don't know if techno, black techno, is the best techno on the face of the earth. I mean, it's an argument, and I would say that's part of why techno as a form is so amazing. And so that's part of it being viral, is that it gets in people's bodies in a different kind of way. And so I'm really like fascinated by that.
Okay.
Thank y'all.
Thank you. Thank you, Arthur.